Today, I want to share a story with B about my winter, deep in the Yukon with my grandfather, and the strange things that occurred during those dark, frozen months. Quick note, this story is a little long. About 3 years ago, when I was at the spry age of 18, I had decided that I wanted to take a year off of school before going to university, to do a bit of soul-searching, if you will. Well, as it happened, my father decided that this would be a great opportunity. You see, my grandfather Dana had been trying to get me to go out to his cottage for a few years now, to, as they put it, learn a little about yourself and your heritage. Now, my grandfather is the toughest son of a bitch that I've ever seen in my life. Here's an example. When I was 15, my family took me skiing in Jasper, and my grandfather tagged along. During that trip, Grandpa Dana hit a fallen log that had been ever so slightly covered in snow and plowed straight into a spruce tree. He tore his lip open down to the cheek, and once we caught up to him, we began freaking out and talking of getting an ambulance. However, he just calmly stood up and told us that he would be fine and was going to go back to the lodge to patch himself up. He told us this all the while his lip was hanging open enough for us to see his teeth. As it turns out, this involves him skiing all the way back, grabbing a sewing needle and some fishing line and stitching his own face back together in the bathroom mirror. An hour later, he was back out on the slopes as though nothing had happened. He still has a vicious scar, too. He is a born Swede and a massive guy, standing around 6'6" and pretty muscular too, despite being in his 60s. He's a pretty quiet guy and rather eccentric. He lives on his own in the middle of a frozen hellscape at a time in his life where most would be retired, so go figure. The main reason I hadn't gone with him sooner was because my mother was terrified of me going off to live with what she saw as a crazy relative for any length of time, despite my father's assertion that I would be well taken care of and was old enough now to fend for myself. Through some Herculean effort of coercion, likely involving the fact that I was moving out soon anyway, I was granted leave to go with him. My family lives in Alberta, and my grandfather off in the northwestern Yukon, past the Minto mine if anyone here knows the area. It was arranged for me to go fly out there and meet up with my grandfather, who would then drive us out to his home. After landing, I was greeted with the amusing sight of my grandfather, standing about a foot above the rest of the crowd and staring forward, waiting for me. We had a quick greeting, and before long, I had hopped into his truck and we were making a trail towards places where no roads go. We drove for a few hours, and not much was said between us, though that was pretty standard for him. And finally, we arrived at what appeared to be a little more than a snowy plot near the tree line and away from the road. "So where exactly is your cabin? I didn't see it on the way over," I asked him. He turned to me and smirked. "About 3 days of hiking that way." He pointed to the trees. And so began day one of my adventure. With a pack slung over my back and snow up to my calves, we began to walk. The first day went pretty normal. Something that was not going to last, let me tell you now. Along the way, he would point out animal tracks and different plants, giving me the basic wilderness survival rundown. Now, I had been raised on a small acreage outside of the also small town of Athabasca, so I was no stranger to the wilderness. But even still, my grandfather's knowledge of the wilds seemed near encyclopedic. Anyway, the first day came to a close as the sun hung low in the sky and snow glittered in the twilight. A beautiful vista if I'd ever seen one. We found a small outcropping and built a fire, and set a can of beans and some vegetables to cook, and enjoyed the moment. I slept pretty soundly, even despite the negative 20-degree weather. On the eve of the second day, I was shaken awake and told to start walking. "We don't want to spend more nights out here than we have to. It's only going to get colder, and these woods are dangerous." Gathering up what I had, little more than a sleeping bag, clothes, and some provisions, and 2 knives, we set off again. Now, let me tell you, there is nothing more tiring than pushing through snow up to your crotch in the middle of the woods for hours and hours. I like to think I'm in okay shape, but by the time we stopped for a break some 4 hours later, I was about ready to die. My grandfather, of course, seemed unfazed by it. It was around this time that I started to take note of a few things. For anyone who has ever lived near or spent a lot of time in the woods, you know it's a pretty lively place. Lots of noise and things moving around. But not here. In the winter, everything is still and quiet. It's a strange feeling when you've heard all your life that if things go quiet in the forest, something bad is near. However, the uneasiness was offset somewhat by the fact that I was trying to stop my lungs from exploding, and also by my grandfather's calm, uncaring demeanor. Soon enough, we had set off again, and a few more hours into walking, I noticed an odd little cave down the hill we were on. The opening had huge icicles hanging down the front, and a few bones could be seen scattered around the area. I had turned to my grandfather, pointing towards it, and asked, "Should we be worried about that?" At that, he stopped, and looked at it for a few moments, before he just continued walking, saying nonchalantly, "No. As long as we get a ways off before night comes, it won't matter." When we finally settled for the night, I was sure I would be out before I hit the ground, but without so much as a glance, I was told to wait. My granddad wanted to go get firewood and start dinner. Sitting myself under a tree, I watched as he walked off, leaving me alone in the dwindling light of the day. As I sat there, I listened to the fading sound of my grandfather walking further and further away. I couldn't help but notice how strangely suffocating the woods were. Now, I had spent days camping before, sometimes with friends and other times alone, but this seemed different. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the way the evergreens, burdened with snow, seemed to blend into the growing gloom, forming strange and inky shapes with their shadows in the dim light. Whatever it was, I started to get nervous. I had that kind of unease that comes when you feel like you're being watched, even though you think you're alone. Before my mind began to walk off into those dark roads of thought, my grandfather came stomping back through the tree line, with bundles of broken branches under his arms. He set about showing me how to start a fire without matches or a lighter, as he's old-fashioned like that. And soon enough, we had a nice little campfire going. It wasn't until the heat of the fire hit me that I noticed how damn cold I was. My hands were stiff, and I had slight shivers going over me. "We should reach the cabin by about this time tomorrow, if we keep up this pace, that is. However, before we go any further, though, I want you to understand something. Things are different out here, and if I tell you to do something, I expect you to listen. Understood?" I nodded, and told him that my dad had given me the rundown before I left. "Oh? How much did he tell you?" "Just to listen to whatever you said and to stay safe," I replied, unsure of where he was going with this. "Ah, all right then." He didn't say anything for the rest of the night, and I was too tired to ask. Despite my exhaustion, I found that I lied awake for quite a while, staring up at the sky and listening to the gentle crackling of the fire. I don't really know why, as I should have no problem sleeping after a day of hiking, but regardless, I found myself quite unable to drift off, even after the moon had risen over and shone over the area. It was around then that I heard something in the forest, like a sort of whispering. At first, I figured it was just the wind, but looking at the treetops, they weren't moving at all. I listened harder, but couldn't make out what was being said, because it was just so faint. I sat up and looked around to see if something was there, or if maybe my grandfather had been mumbling in his sleep, but when I tried to listen again, it was silent. I figured it was just something on the breeze and laid back down again, and sleep came soon after. I was once again woken up by Dana, as the sun had just begun its slow creep over the distant mountains. As we gathered up our equipment, he asked me if I had slept well, and I told him that the cold would take a little getting used to, but otherwise, it was fine. He just sort of looked at me for a moment before grunting and tying off his pack. And once more we set off, deeper into the wilderness. The third day went without incident. It was only after yet more hours of tedious and exhausting trailblazing that we finally came into view of my grandfather's home, built right up against a cliff face with no windows. It was just massive logs the whole way around, and a small chimney rose up from the roof. It was kind of easy to spot, given that the trees had been cleared in around a 20-meter radius around the cabin, replaced with numerous small wooden stakes set at varying intervals. As we got closer, I noticed that they were actually fence posts, and barbed wire was strung between them, and every so often there was a much taller post, set a ways back from the fence. In the dim light, I couldn't really make much out about it, and I was curious as to why they were there. Whatever the reason, though, I was in no mood to play 20 questions. I just wanted to get inside and sleep in a warm place. Before we could get in, however, it seemed that there were a few things to be done. My grandfather lifted one of the posts out of the ground, allowing us to enter, and told me to put it back in and make sure it wasn't going to fall. He was going to go get the door open, and thankfully, it didn't take too long. The snow around the cabin was much less than the surrounding area, making walking blessedly easier. After I finished, I made my way around the side of the cabin and found my grandfather carefully taking down numerous little metallic things that hung around the door. I could see them glinting in what little daylight was left, but I couldn't make out exactly what they were supposed to be. Again, I was just too tired to really care, and just wandered inside behind my grandfather as soon as he finished taking down the last one. "That bed over there will be yours," he said, pointing to a small cot in one corner of the room. Without much more thought, I ambled over and went to sleep. I really should have savored it more, as this was the last good night's rest I was going to have for a while. I woke up the next morning to a mostly dark room, and a candle was set out on the table in the middle of the cottage, giving enough light for me to figure out where the door was. Opening it, I stepped outside, and I was greeted to a bright midday sun. Down the yard, a ways away, I saw Dana finishing clearing the excess snow from the plot of land. It was now low enough that I could actually see the ground, but even then, a few feet beyond the fence, the snow rose like a small wall around us. The light, and my 14 hours of sleep, allowed me to really take in stock of the area around me. I could now see that the tall posts from the night before had been whittled down, so only the pale heartwood remained, and carved all over them were words, thousands of them, all tightly packed and varying from neat to nigh indecipherable scratches. I read through them, and there didn't really seem to be any rhyme or reason to what was written down. Mostly it was just random words, in Swedish and a few in Norwegian. I'm not fluent, but I had picked up a little over the years. I guess Dana had noticed me staring at it as he began to walk over. "What are these supposed to be?" I gestured to the other posts of a similar nature around the yard. They were part of an ordvag, or word wall. It helps keep things calm at night. I wouldn't stare at them for too long, though. Won't do your head much good. In case it wasn't already somewhat apparent, my grandfather was an odd sort. He never liked staying in towns or normal houses, and always carried around these little ruins and charms on strings. I always found it neat, and when I was younger, I would often ask what they meant, and I'd listen to his stories for hours. My mother always had a problem with him visiting. I'd overhear her talking to my dad about allowing Dana to fill my head with crazy nonsense, on more than one occasion, but he'd often just shrug it off and say something along the lines of, "It's good for him to learn a little bit about Dad's culture." The point here is that it was only after I got a good look at the cabin and the word wall that these weird things began to sink in. The first day we went out to chop out a few trees for firewood, he would very specifically point out which trees we were going to cut down, but only after pressing his ear to them and listening to see if they were unmarked. When I asked him what that meant, he just said that some trees were special to the forest and that we shouldn't touch them. Otherwise, the Tomtenosar would get angry, and we really didn't want that. For those who don't know, the Tomtenosar are part of Scandinavian folklore. They basically look like garden gnomes and act sort of like Santa Claus, or at least that's how they're portrayed now. Growing up, my granddad would tell me about these little monsters, and about how they would chew open people's doors and windows in order to crawl into their houses at night and whisper things as they slept. The people would sometimes go crazy, wandering out into the woods or ranting in incoherent babble. Other times, they would just become sort of different. Either way, they were freaky little bastards. But I stopped believing the stories around the same time I figured out that Santa Claus was bunk. Dana really isn't known for his sense of humor, so hearing him say that was more than a little strange. I sort of awkwardly laughed at it. You think I'm joking? Keep that up, and you won't be seeing summer. That shut me up pretty quick. I still didn't particularly buy the stories, but I still made sure not to tap the trees that he said were marked. We finished loading up the sleds we had brought with us, and at that point, Dana said, "Let's go this way. I want to show you something before we get back." I followed him, and it seemed to me like we were making a wide arc instead of going straight back, but I wasn't going to argue. As we walked, I noticed that there were no animal tracks, as in absolutely none. Even on the way to the cabin, I had at least picked out a few prints from rabbits or moose and the like. When I asked why we hadn't come across any, despite being so far in the woods, I was told that they don't like it here. They know to stay away. Why's that? I asked. These woods aren't safe for much of anyone after dark, least of all critters. After walking a while longer, we reached a high at the edge of a section of forest that we were in. Dana pointed out beyond the now sparse tree line, and what lay past it was the vast snowy rises and falls of the untamed wild, and honestly, it was one of the most beautiful things that I had ever seen. There was an overturned tree, and he motioned for me to sit on it. For a little while, we just sat there, taking in the view until he sighed. Now, I know you are going to be new to all of this for a while, but I think you ought to know. Things are different out here. I need you to trust me when I tell you something, or else it could get both of us killed. Do you understand? I said I did. I figured that he had taken my reaction to him talking about the Tomtenosar to heart. He may be strange, but he means well, so I figured I would humor him and make things easier for both of us. However, that would prove to be a very, very bad idea. Once we got back and finished stacking the firewood, Dana broke out more of our dwindling provisions, and as we were cooking, he said that tomorrow we would need to go hunting, and that if we caught anything, he would show me how to properly butcher an animal. We ate and settled in for the night, but as we were settling in, he told me that if I ever got up in the night to use the outhouse to the side of the cabin, I should always bring a candle, no matter how bright the moon was, and that if it goes out, I should come back inside right away. And with that, he set up a small dangling metal thing on the door. When I asked him about it, he told me that it was there to confuse anything that was trying to get in. Later on during that winter, I found out it's supposed to be a ruin of illusions or disguise. I guess the idea is that it would make it harder to tell what was inside the cabin if something got inside the door. The next few days we went out hunting, and for the first while we didn't catch anything. And it wasn't helped by how we needed to head a fair ways away from the cabin before we saw signs of animal life. And Dana always insisted that we be back before nightfall, and on top of that, he didn't bring a gun, ever, just a bow and some arrows. I know bow hunting is a common practice, but given that bears roamed these woods, I figured that it would be nice to have something with a little bit more stopping power. Eventually, we actually managed to find and snag a buck. and it was a nice one too. Enough meat that we would be alright for a while. We threw it on the sleigh and began dragging it back home. Hours ticked away before we got back to the cabin, and something rather interesting was waiting for us there. Ravens. Normally, this wouldn't seem so strange, but when I hadn't seen signs of life except for the trees in the area for almost a week, it seemed a little off. Dana stiffened up when he noticed too. When I asked him about it, he told me, "Drop the sled and come with me. We need to butcher this fast." I wasn't sure where this was going, but remembering our conversation from earlier, I figured that it would be best to just go with it. We circled around the cabin, and the ravens sitting on the roof were just watching us the whole way. Lying in a small snowdrift in front of the door was a rabbit's head, and just the head, cleanly severed. The snow was still a bright red, so it had to have been pretty fresh. There was also a little indent through the snow leading up to it, making it look like that it had been thrown over there. Well, it could be worse. We didn't really need the head anyway. When I asked what he was talking about, he told me, "It's only right to return a gift with a gift. Take that head inside and meet me near the butcher shed." That evening, we butchered the deer, and when we were done, my grandfather took the head, antlers and all, and walked out into the woods a short ways, before gently setting it down and coming back. We brought the rest of the meat over to the cabin, and Dana took the rabbit's head off the table where I had placed it. That night, we had rabbit stew and potatoes. When I asked about why we were going to just eat something we found sitting there, he told me that it would be rude to just throw it out, and it wasn't wise to, as he said it, insult the neighbors. "There are other people out here? I thought you lived alone." "Alone? No. I just don't live by people." "Who are your neighbors?" "I thought I already told you. The Tom Tinisar live here." And I didn't have a very good response to that. The next morning, we went out to check the fence, as was becoming a routine. I walked out to see the spot where he put the head down, and there was nothing there, not even a little bit of blood. The next few weeks went by in relative peace. We would collect firewood every so often, went ice fishing occasionally, and every morning we cleared out snow from the cabin. The temperature continued to drop as the winter solstice drew near, and the already short days were now becoming a scant few hours of near perpetual twilight. You would think it would get old seeing the same setting sun through most of the day, but you'd be wrong. It managed to be breathtaking each and every time. I probably would have stood there staring at it all day if I wasn't being ushered along by Dana. Things probably would have continued much the same way, but one night I fucked up. It was somewhere around mid-December, and we were going ice fishing again. We set out early, as the sun was just barely peeking over the distant mountains, and hiked for about an hour, until we reached a small frozen-over lake. We prepared as we always did, checking the ice's thickness and cutting out a hole, etc. But after only a few minutes into it, we heard the snapping and crackling of branches behind us. We both stopped and stared for a few moments, before my grandfather said that it was fine, though I could tell he was bothered. Every so often, he'd look back and scan around the trees. We weren't having much luck with the fish, and were about to call it in for the day when I got a tug on my line. I pulled up a big trout and thought that this was great. We hadn't had a fish in a while. When I turned to see if my grandfather had noticed, I saw him just sort of staring at it. A little confused, I gave it another look over and saw that it had a few huge gashes taken out of it, and indented lines cutting through the gray scales. "Throw it back. This is not ours to take." "Oh, okay then." I was a little nervous at this. Although not too much had happened during my time here, I had at least managed to pick up that when Dana got weird like this, it was just best not to argue. I threw the fish back into the pond, and we started making tracks back to the cabin. Along the way, I noticed that the trees near the lake, the ones we heard the noise coming from, had huge cuts taken out of them. Not like with an axe or bear claws. More like numerous small chunks had been ripped out and thrown around. I asked what that was about, and Dana just started walking faster, and said that we shouldn't have come here and that it wouldn't be safe. One of my more frequent chores was to go out and make sure the Ordvog's posts were still secure in the ground. Of the many things that my grandfather was methodical about keeping just right, the word wall came second only to our food. This mainly involved going out and giving them a solid shove, and if there was any give, I needed to hammer them in and pack more snow around the bottom until I could no longer move them. Anyway, that night, he insisted that we go over all of them again before going to sleep, and so we went out after finishing our dinner. Mostly deer. You'd be surprised how long a single deer can last. He took one end of the yard, and I the other. It was getting blistering cold out, where any bare skin began to sting, and a cloud cover had swept over the land. There were no stars and no moon tonight, and the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving everything in inky black and gray. And, worst of all, it was quiet again, like our hike up here, where every little movement you made sounded like an earthquake. A little ways off, I could hear my grandfather working, with the shifting of his coat and the snow being pressed underfoot. I was about 3 posts down when I found one that was a little loose. I straightened it out and picked up the sledgehammer we used for driving them back into the ground. As I lifted it up and got ready to bring it down on the post, I cringed because I knew that in the suffocating silence of the forest, this was going to be very loud. But as I was about to swing, I heard something, like a quiet hissing mumble. Reflexively, I swung around while I was bringing the hammer down and hit the post with a glancing blow, knocking it off center. Spinning around, I tried to listen for it again, thinking that maybe it was my imagination. The woods will often make you think you're hearing things that you just aren't. After a few seconds of nothing, and figuring that it was either just me imagining it or overhearing Dana saying something to himself under his breath, I turned to fix the post again, but just as I put my back to the trees, I heard it again. It seemed so quiet that I couldn't make out what was being said, but I'm sure that it was someone whispering, and in a whistle-like tone. I began to really freak out, and slowly, without turning away from the tree line, walked back towards the cabin, as I scanned the trees looking for where this sound was coming from. The noise didn't seem like it had a direction to it. It was like it was everywhere at once, still quiet and indiscernible, but very much still there. While in panic mode, combined with being tired and cold, I got it in my head that if I threw something into the woods, it might scare off whoever was there. So, reaching into the woodpile we had outside, I picked up a small log and tossed it into the tree line, and began shouting about how whoever was there needed to come out. And my grandfather came running over. "Anon, what the fuck are you doing?" I told him that I heard someone talking nearby, and before he could reply, the trees near where I threw the log began to shake, and I could hear snapping branches. "Get inside, now," he said, not taking his eyes off the trees. And so the two of us backpedaled into the cabin, and by the time we closed the door, most of the trees around us had begun shaking. The once oppressive stillness of the woods was now replaced with something akin to a hurricane. That night, neither of us slept. We just sort of stared at the door, with my grandfather holding his hunting knife. Throughout the night, that sound didn't die down. It was so loud and violent that I thought the trees must have been snapped in half by now. And periodically, we heard things hitting the cabin wall, and there were crunches and ripping noises from every direction. I told myself that it had to be just branches hitting the wall, and that it must have been just a bad storm. Around an hour before dawn, things began to settle down, and soon enough, my grandfather got up and went outside. I heard him start to swear and curse, so I hurried out after him and saw what had been done. The outside walls of the cabin had been covered, every inch from top to bottom, with words, violently slashed into the wood, and chunks had been ripped out of the corners and the door, and the fence was in ruins. Some of the barbed wire had been thrown into the treetops, and many of the posts were smashed into splinters. After a string of curses that I could barely understand, my grandfather finally began to calm down. "Never do anything like that again, ever. Come on, we need to get the fence fixed before nightfall." And like that, he set off to start gathering up the broken fences. At this point, I had gone from thinking my grandfather was a little unhinged to taking his native folklore to heart, right up to thinking that he was the sanest man on earth. I helped him pick up the scattered remains of the fence, and every so often we would find little bits of fabric or hair stuck in the bars, but I knew better than to ask why. We were making good time on having the barbed wire fixed, but I was still very worried, as most of the posts that made up the word wall had been broken or were now missing. When I asked about this, he said that hopefully this was just a warning. Tomorrow we'll go hunting and then bring them back something as a gift. Thank you for not killing us last night. At this point in the year, there was only about 6 hours of daylight, making it very difficult to do anything really. Just as the sun began to set again, we had just managed to get the barbed wire back into a rough semicircle around the cabin. Given the damage that had been done the night before, I asked how much good the barbed wire would actually do, and he told me that it didn't stop them, but it slowed them down since their beards and hats would get tangled in it, and they had a very hard time getting free. I couldn't tell if that was a joke or not, but at this point, I was ready to believe anything. And yet, little did I know, I hadn't seen anything yet. The problem was that when the occurrence happened, it was almost December 21st, and that means that the cold was near unbearable. That, and there was so little daylight that by the time we got to the part of the wild where animals roamed normally, it was nearly time to begin to head back. The first day we went out and searched for signs of animals we could bag, but we didn't see so much as a squirrel, and that night, the wind was howling again. All the while, I would stare at the cracks between the log walls, where the candlelight didn't touch, and I could swear I saw things moving in the dark. When I finally did drift off to sleep, the last thing I heard was a quiet whispering, like I had heard before. And the next few days were no better. Each time we would go deeper and deeper into the woods, and usually in the direction of the distant mountains. But we would be frozen stiff to where walking was a challenge for me. And I had no idea how my grandfather managed it at this age, but he never slowed down. But even so, we came back from our hunts empty-handed each and every time. And each night, the woods would be louder. The shadows in the cabin seemed to draw closer to the candle than the night prior, and the whispering seemed to get more intense as well. So much so that I began to make out words, though none of them were in English, and if they were in Swedish, I couldn't understand what I was hearing. On the third night, I asked Dana if he could hear it also. He told me to try not to think about it. Each day was more overcast than the last, and the daylight was now just becoming a lighter shade of gray. It got to the point where our food stores were also getting low, and our need to find something, anything during our hunts, became very desperate. It started to get worse by the fifth day, because that's when it began to snow. Not your simple puffy white snow that you see further south. No. This was big, heavy, and wet flakes that seemed more like little snowballs landing everywhere. It clung to everything, weighing us down and the trees alike. And on top of this, the forest was already misty, and we could hardly see more than a few meters. I kept swearing I could see things out there, little shapes sitting on rocks and tree branches, but then in a moment, they would be gone, as soon as I looked directly at it. I asked my grandfather, and he told me not to acknowledge them, and to just keep moving. But the longer the days went, the more of them I would see. It was on the 9th day of trying and failing at our hunts that we returned to a troubling sight. All along the tree line surrounding the cabin, a couple meters off the barbed wire fence, there were a number of large stones, big boulders in fact, that came up to my chest. Most were oddly shaped, where the tops curved off in a direction. They were all pointing at the cabin. They had been placed every few feet all along the tree line, almost like a fence of the forest's own. When we saw that, Dana stopped and said, "Pack your things, we are leaving at dawn." I wasn't going to argue. Even as we got past the fence and closed the door, I felt like we were still being watched from something out in the snow. But it was too dark to see any of the little shapes that had been following us whenever we went outside. But I knew they were there, and that there was hardly a moment when they weren't. Sometime in the middle of the night, between the howling winds and the biting cold, there was a deafening crash, and the door split down the middle. Snow and frost was now flying in and blowing out the only candle we had before we even knew what happened. There was a scurrying noise, and after a few seconds, my grandfather managed to light a little oil lantern he had hanging by the wall. But when he did, the sight was terrible. The table and pantries had been overturned, and everything not nailed down was either broken or scattered around the room. I asked if we should leave right now, but he told me that that is what they would want us to do, that we need to wait until first light. And what followed was the longest night of my life. We sat there, shivering and staring at the broken door, the lantern's light just barely keeping the dark away, and who knows what else. Several times I thought I saw something there, just outside the door, watching us. When I saw the horizon getting brighter, it was like waking up from a nightmare, but this one wasn't quite over yet. We grabbed whatever hadn't been broken and made for civilization. The snow had stopped, but the clouds still hung heavy above us. It would be about 3 days until we got back to the truck. We moved as fast as we could, and the snow was so deep and clingy that we had to stop every kilometer or so just to wipe it off. It weighed us down more than our packs did. I don't know how far we traveled. I just know that we didn't stop, and I don't think we ate until it got dark. Dana said to get as much firewood as I could find, and that we needed a very big fire. What about the marked trees? I asked. I still wasn't sure if things could get worse. Fuck them. They're already pissed. It won't matter now. That night, we had a massive bonfire going. I'd bet you could see it from one of the mountains nearby, it was so bright. And yet, even so, we could hear them out there, because the whispers never stopped. Every now and then, a branch or a rock would come flying out at us toward the fire. It didn't make a restful night. And then, around an hour before dawn, the snow started up again. The second day was the worst yet. With the snow back, these little fucks got brave and began getting in very close. Every now and then, we would get hit with something that fell from the tree branches, or a tree would then suddenly fall down on our path, making it harder to progress. And we didn't walk, we ran through those woods. I didn't think I could run so far, but I don't remember either of us stopping. We managed to stumble into a little clearing as the light began fading again. We hurried and grabbed whatever wood we could find and tried starting the fire. The wood was wet and uncooperative, and the shadows began to get close. We could see the little moving figures on the edge of our vision again. I guess Dana was getting to his wit's end because he grabbed a little oil lantern, broke it open, and poured the oil across the logs and lit it up with the lantern's sparker. The shadows around us retreated for a moment, and I think the little monsters were hissing at us in anger. We were left mostly alone that night. Hell if I know why. Maybe even they need to rest sometime. The snow hadn't quit yet, so by the time we woke up, we were both mostly covered. We set out before the sun rose. I think Dana didn't trust us to make the rest of the journey in only a few hours of light. The trail was a fucking mess. Trees and rocks littered the animal trails, and the bush was so thick with evergreens that it was no better. It was slow going, and of course, we were still being followed. We would still catch sight of them at the edge of our vision, watching and whispering in tune with the wind. I couldn't even tell which was which by this point, and sometimes I still can't. For whatever reason, we were left mostly untouched on the rest of the way back. The poor trail conditions slowed us down to the point that it was already dark, and we still hadn't made it to the truck. Dana didn't want to stop though. He said we were close and didn't want to risk another night outside. I'm not sure when it was, but we eventually made our way out of the trees and onto the road. We followed it for a few minutes until we saw it. The glorious car that would get us out of this place. Covered under a few feet of snow, though it was. We swept out the truck bed, threw our things in, and drove away. I don't think either of us looked back. After we got back in town, we stayed at an inn for the night. And let me tell you now, that was the best goddamn rest of my life. We woke up early and drove for nearly the entire day until we made it to the Eric Nelson Airport. When we got back, Dana stayed with my family for a little while, at my dad's behest. We didn't talk much about the trip, but just told my family that we needed to come home early. That next spring, Dana left and said he was going back home. I asked him what the fuck he was thinking going back there, and he told me he had lived in those woods for almost 20 years, and that it was his home, and that he would also stay there for as long as he had left. He promised to call or visit on occasion, but that was 3 years ago, and none of us had heard from him since. My parents are convinced that he passed away, and they're probably right. But I can't help wanting to know. And that is where we come to today. I told my friends about what happened that winter, and they don't really buy it, but I can't blame them. However, we've been talking on and off for a year now about going on a camping trip, and I jokingly mentioned that maybe we should go out to my grandfather's cabin. They thought it was a great idea. We're currently in the Sky Motel in Whitehorse, and we're leaving for the cabin tomorrow morning. I'm still convinced that this is a bad idea, but I want to know what happened to my granddad when he came back here. We planned for the trip to be a little less than a month long, and we picked summer since I think it would be safer than the dead of winter like last time. Anyways, this is the last story I'm going to be posting on here for a while. Come the beginning of September, I'll start a thread and let you all know what happens. I'll take pictures where I can, and I've brought a lot of spare batteries from my phone. Wish us luck.